We come this morning to chapter 6 in our Sunday preaching series from the Gospel of Mark. Wending our way through the Gospel is like walking through a great art gallery filled with different portraits. Mark is the quintessential artist. He has this amazing ability to paint word pictures of Jesus. As we have heard, Mark is not only the shortest of the four canonical Gospels, but the earliest one as well. The source for his Gospel is the preaching notes of the Apostle Peter. Both were in Rome at the time, and Mark is listening to Peter's amazing stories about Jesus. And he writes them down in such a way that results in a veritable portrait gallery of Jesus. Now, Mark is a gospel of action. For example, he really likes using the word immediately to move his readers from one point in the story to the next. Fast-paced and moving, he gives us a magnificent tour throughout the gallery of Jesus' life, ministry, and mission, without ever having the audience get bored from lingering too long in one place. He lets us peer into different episodes and narratives of Jesus' life and teaching, but we don't ever dwell too long in one place. One of Mark's strategies is to tell something in summary form, but not to give any explanation until later on in the gospel. For example, in chapter 1, we are told that Jesus goes into the synagogue and teaches, but we're not told of the content of the teaching until chapter 4. Again, in chapter 1, we're told that John the Baptist was put into prison, but we don't hear the rest of that sordid story or what dancing can lead to until chapter 6. Mark structures his gospel around several word pictures of Jesus. And as in any gallery, there are large frescoes that cover an entire wall, and there are small cameos. So too, in his gospel, we have large portraits of Jesus that span several chapters of the gospel. And then we have these smaller ones that sometimes only appear in one scene, and we don't come back to them again. Now, Mark's overarching narrative is centered around four dominant portraits of Jesus. Let me give them to you this morning. Jesus as teacher covers chapters 1 to 4. Jesus as prophet covers 5, 6, and 7. Jesus as the Messiah are chapters 8 and 9. And then Jesus as the rejected king take us from 10 to 16. Now, these are the large wall-sized frescoes that he paints for his readers. Now, since chapter and verse divisions came along much later, how Mark would alert his audience, because he wouldn't say turn to chapter 2, verse 1, Mark would alert his audience to a major portrait change through a twofold pattern. There would be the casting out of a demon, and there would be the healing of a sick person. And within these larger pictures come smaller cameos, such as what our text this morning displays when we see Jesus as shepherd. Mark will also show us the portrait of Jesus as the Son of Man. Now, this is a portrait only he himself says. No one calls Jesus the Son of Man but himself. And surely this is a reference to the figure in Daniel chapter 7. Sometimes we get the cameo of Jesus as the Son of David, which is how blind Bartimaeus will address him. And interesting, that cameo of Jesus as Son of David comes in the Rejected King larger fresco. Now, if there's one overarching portrait that Mark wants us to lay a hold of, that he wants us to walk away from the gospel saying, I know this about Jesus, it's that he is the Son of God. He begins his gospel with these exact words, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. We hear it at Jesus' baptism, which inaugurates his ministry, when the voice from the cloud says, "You are my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." We hear it midway through the gospel at his transfiguration, which is the turning point. From that moment on, the cross looms on the horizon, and again you hear the claiming of Jesus as God's Son. And then we hear it again at the end, on the lips of the centurion who stood at the foot of the cross. Truly, this man was the Son of God. Surely this portrait that begins, centers, and ends the gospel is the key picture that Mark wants us to focus on. Well, that's the big picture. That's the background to the large story of Mark. Our text this morning finds itself in chapter 6, which is the heart of the portrait of Jesus as prophet. Now, we need a little bit of background to this. From Carrie's sermon, we realize that Jesus has already identified himself as a prophet when the people and family from his hometown reject him. And Jesus says these words, "No prophet is welcome in his own hometown." And so we've moved from the portrait of teacher in chapters 1 to 4 to now the portrait of prophet in 5 to 7. But there's something else Mark begins to do in this fantastic portrait. He begins to show us that Jesus follows the pattern of the Old Testament charismatic prophets Elijah and Elisha. Did you notice that all three will perform water miracles? Elijah shuts up the heaven from rain. Elisha causes an axe head to float on top of water, and if anybody has ever dropped something iron in the water, they know it does not float. And Mark portrays Jesus walking on the water. So all three of them, under the picture of prophet, perform water miracles. All three of them have resurrections from the dead. Elijah raises the son of the widow from Zarephath. Elisha raises the Shunammite woman's boy. And so too Mark portrays Jesus as raising Jairus' daughter from the dead. Did you notice there was also a negative example from all three prophets? Elijah pronounces judgment upon Jezebel. Elisha sends a bear out to maul some young men and pronounces the leprosy Naaman had now transferred to his servant Gehazi. And Jesus in Mark's gospel speaks a judgment on a fig tree. Over and over again, Mark is portraying Jesus as one of the charismatic prophets like Elijah and Elisha. And in chapter 6, we have the multiplication of food. Was Elijah involved in the multiplication of food with the widow's oil? Was Elisha involved in the multiplication of food when he had 20 loaves of barley feed over 100 soldiers? Well, here we have Jesus feeding 5,000 men, and Mark is careful to use the Greek word male, men here, which tells me 5,000 is the minimum by the time you added their wives and their children. All of the charismatic prophets' work mirrored in Jesus. But it's not just Elijah and Elisha that Mark patterns Jesus after, but the prophet like Moses from Deuteronomy 18. First, there's the miraculous feeding of manna when the Israelites are in the desert. Mark gives us the geographical marker in chapter 6 that Jesus was in the wilderness, the same word for desert. Second, in that narrative, Mark tells us that Jesus says they were like sheep without a shepherd. That might ring some bells for us. Would it surprise you to learn that Moses spoke like this in the Old Testament? In Numbers 27, Moses tells Joshua, "May the Lord, the God of the spirits of humanity, appoint a man over the congregation who will go out and come in before them and lead them out and bring them in, so that the congregation of the Lord," listen carefully, "will not be like sheep that have no shepherd." Notice the picture Mark is painting for us. Both Elijah and Elisha and now Moses with his word parallels. This is what Mark shows us of Jesus in chapter 6. Now, our passage this morning has Jesus in a dilemma. It is a real pickle. The whole chapter has references to eating. I wondered if you noticed that as we went along, Carrie's sermon, Jeff's sermon, the sermon this morning, and the ones coming up, all have references to eating or bread in them. When Jesus sends them out 2 by 2, they're not to take any bread, but they were to rely on the provision of God through those who would host them. Then Mark inserts the narrative of John's ignominious death centered around a salacious banquet. Did you ever notice there's 2 banquets happening in chapter 6? There's this awful one that results in death after a lewd dance, and then there's this wonderful banquet in the wilderness that results in giving the people life. After John's death, Jesus takes his disciples on a retreat into the wilderness, and listen again to the reference. We're told they did not have time to eat. And now there's a throng of people who have not eaten at all. Clearly, food in general and bread in specific characterize this portrait of Jesus' prophet. Mark tells us that when Jesus sees the crowd and realizes that they might be hungry, the text says he has compassion toward them. Isn't that a wonderful phrase? Isn't that what you want in a shepherd? Ought not that to be a chief character trait of one's pastor, that they have compassion? Jesus sees this large crowd, and the first thing we're told, he has compassion because they're like sheep without a shepherd. What a grand portrait. What an amazing picture of the kind of shepherd Jesus is towards his people. And of course, we're not surprised that those put in charge, his disciples, are thinking more about themselves and their bank accounts than the ministry of the kingdom. How quickly the disciples forgot the miraculous provision of the Lord when they were on their evangelistic tour. How quickly they forgot that their needs were provided for, even though they were told by Jesus, don't take bread, don't take bag, don't take money, don't even take a second pair of clothes. In fact, the only thing we want you to take is a walking stick. How quickly they forgot what it was like for them to receive a blessing but not to be part of providing a blessing. And so they come impudent and respond to Jesus with sarcasm. Shall we go and spend 200 denarii on bread and give it to them to eat? Now, what we have to hear is that in 44 BC, Julius Caesar set the currency for the denarii. A Roman soldier's annual pay was 100 denarii. And so when they come in this way, speaking to Jesus in such impudence, they're saying something like, well, where are we going to get $200,000 to buy loaves of bread? Look how quickly they forgot. Insufferable insolence and sarcasm in the face of Jesus' compassion toward the hungry. At this appalling lack of faith and memory, their own memory, Jesus has the crowd sit down in specific groups that reminds the careful reader of Jethro's counsel to Moses. The fact that Mark tells us they sat on green grass. We would just say, go sit on the grass. But the fact that Mark includes the word green is a detail of eyewitness account. And it brings our minds back to Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. And we cannot forget that in spite of their insufferable insolence, there are 12 baskets of food left over for each of the disciples, and it didn't cost them 1 penny, never mind 200 denarii. And so what are we at Bakerview to glean from our passage this morning? First, the portrait of Jesus as compassionate shepherd is sublime. When was the last time you experienced compassion from someone? When was the last time you extended compassion toward someone? In our text, Jesus meets need with provision. Jesus meets doubt with action. Jesus meets forgetfulness with another, stronger memory. I think these are so important. Let me give them to you once more. Jesus meets need with provision. Jesus meets doubt with action. Jesus meets forgetfulness with another, stronger memory. Second, the cameo of Jesus as compassionate shepherd is found within the larger portrait of Jesus as prophet. What is Jesus prophetically saying to us at Bakerview in 2021? What are we hearing from the Lord? What are we hearing in terms of provision, in terms of getting our action going, having our memory refreshed? Will we react as the townfolk of Nazareth, who reject and dishonor him so much that he could not do many miracles? Will we react like that? Will we react like the crowd who cannot get enough of Jesus, even though it means the risk of discomfort? Finally, this morning, how do we train our hearts and lives to be characterized by compassion? You see, we're often very good at feeling sympathy for those in dire straits, but compassion urges us to do something about it. Sympathy is how you feel. Compassion is doing something about the way you feel? Are we at Bakerview characterized by sympathy or compassion? What has Jesus been prophetically saying to Bakerview in 2021? This week, may we all remember the extraordinary provision of the Lord. May we all remember the shepherd and guardian of our souls who compassionately leads us to green pastures and alongside still waters. May we all be attentive to the prophetic word of the Lord as Bakerview considers its future. Amen.